Is America a representative democracy? Well, I'm not so sure. Earlier this week, the Colorado Supreme Court barred former President Donald Trump from the state's 2024 primary ballot. The court found that Trump engaged in an insurrection on January 6 and is not eligible to run for president of the United States. Public reporters Zaid Jilani and Alex Gutentag make the case that even while you might not agree with things Trump has said in the past and may even admit that he has adopted extreme and inflammatory rhetoric, in a democratic society, voters still have the right to see Trump's name on the ballot and even vote for him if they want to.
In their latest reporting, Jilani and Gutentag detail the Transition Integrity Project, an alleged plan on the Democratic front to, quote, undermine the 2020 election. Joining us now to discuss all of this is reporter at Public, Zaid Jilani. Welcome back, Zaid. Long time no see.
Yeah, I know. It's great to be here.
Zaid, so help us understand what this Democratic-led effort to undermine the 2020 election is all about.
Yeah, so the Transition Integrity Project was basically a group of, Democratic Party affiliated or loosely tied to Democratic Party officials, academics, think tankers, and folks who generally supported getting Trump out of office. Basically, what they did is they got together and they sort of war gamed different scenarios for what could happen with the election. And some of those scenarios were somewhat close to what actually did happen, which is that Trump lost the election, refused to admit it. But other ones would included something like a narrow Trump victory or something closer or to a narrower victory for Biden. And in some of those scenarios, they actually anticipated Democrats doing things like maybe having mass protests, even sending competing slates of electors. And it wasn't necessarily that they were advocating for these things, but it showed that they did anticipate this as a possibility from the Democratic Party, because I think there was so much intense anger against Trump and also just polarization. And I think, part of this speaks to this larger desire from the Democrats, I think, since Trump was elected in 2016, to just kind of get rid of him by any means necessary. In some cases, that meant impeachments. In other cases, that meant even a month into his term, Congressman John Lewis, who, of course, did so much to establish a truer democracy in the United States, was calling Trump illegitimate. I think that was in January 2017, if I remember correctly. I think all of this kind of feeds into these court cases, which are largely being brought to court with the assistance of Democratic Party aligned groups like Crew in this case in Colorado and similar groups in other states, to kind of disqualify Donald Trump from office. And look, it's entirely understandable that Democrats oppose Donald Trump. They oppose him on almost all his policies. They hate his rhetoric. They find his personal behavior to be irredeemable, and they find him to be disruptive to American democracy. But the question is, isn't it healthiest to kind of hash that out in the Democratic square and defeat him at the ballot box, instead of trying to go through these sort of legal routes or criminal routes? Now, of course, that doesn't mean that anyone is above the law, right? If Trump was actually convicted of insurrection, I think there would be no question in anyone's mind that he wouldn't be eligible for the presidency. But even Jack Smith, who's been leading the federal side of this, didn't convict Trump for insurrection. He chose not to do that. And there are still a number of court cases Trump is involved in at both the federal and state level, and we'll see how those play out. But I do think it can be potentially dangerous territory for us to be looking at a candidate who in some polls is actually leading Biden and almost all polls is leading the Republican race, and just kind of disqualifying him by fiat because, generally speaking, I think they don't like him, right? And they're just testing every legal theory they can to do that.
What would you say to someone, who looks at the Transition Project and says, well, okay, some Democratic-aligned people consider doing, all of these things to maybe object to or reverse or stay in power, or stop Trump from staying in power, but Trump actually did it. Republicans actually tried it. They actually went forward with all those schemes. So how can you say, we're the bigger danger?
Well, look, I think that it's absolutely true that a lot of what Trump did around the election was at the very least inappropriate, right? Whether it's criminal or not will be decided in a number of court cases, including the one right here where I live in Georgia. But I think that the problem is that Trump's inappropriate behavior generally is responded to by all these institutions, right? Like he's going to court in several different jurisdictions and states over these issues. The media generally is stacked against him. I think that there is an accountability measure for Trump in place there. But unfortunately, I think sometimes those accountability tools are not properly deployed against what the Democrats did in a lot of these cases. I mean, for instance, one of the most egregious things was that in the 2020 election, we had social media firms sort of collaborating and colluding to suppress an actual true story that kind of looked bad for President Biden's son, Hunter. Now, maybe in this case, the cover-up was worse than the crime, right? I don't know that that story would have been all that damaging for Biden or would have impacted the election, but the fact they went through such lengths, not only by pressuring social media firms, but also by recruiting dozens of folks who were in the intelligence community to come out and say, oh, this was just propaganda. I think that those things those things do undermine democracy, and I don't think there's been proper accountability for them, the same way that I do think that a lot of Trump's misbehavior is accounted for. I do think that there is sort of a mechanism in there to contain him and to properly sift through all this. But with the Democrats, unfortunately, often there isn't. And that includes, sort of a wide collusion between different sections of society, ranging from intelligence to social media firms and corporations to folks in government. And that's a threat to democracy, I think, that isn't quite as examined as it should be.
Is the argument that conservatives don't weaponize the CIA and the FBI to advance their interest when they're in office in the same way that Democrats do?
Well, I would be careful about saying they don't do it at all. I think that at this moment in history, the various things I just mentioned, ranging from social media firms to the intelligence agencies to a lot of these think tanks and academia and media and so on and so forth, happen to be more aligned with the Democrats. But I think part of the reason you should be concerned about this is because there could be a future where these institutions realign on the right and that they start using these tools. Or maybe Trump is elected again and he decides that he wants to kind of weaponize these agencies in the same way they're weaponized against him, right? I think that's part of what people don't understand about it sometimes when they view it purely through partisan lens. And, we can get into the recent arguments about freedom of speech the same way. I think a lot of people on the left kind of poo-pooed it, didn't think, they would ever have a trouble on their side. But now we've seen so many people advocating for Palestinians being censored over the past couple months, using many of the same tools and language that they themselves are using against the right. So I think, it's at this point, the sort of the actual institutions that we're fingering or we're pointing the finger at right now are with the Democrats. I mean, Democrats are trying to throw Trump off. In some cases, they're trying to throw him off the ballot. Not all Democrats are doing that, but some are. But in the future, the shoe could be on the other foot. And I think that's part of why you should be concerned about this no matter what party you happen to affiliate with.
I will say, Zaid, that I think that some of the accusations about hypocrisy, the left didn't realize that it was going to be in this position as it used the tools against Donald Trump that are now being used against itself. It only looks like hypocrisy if you're calling liberal and left the same group. The left has throughout been, I think, getting a lot of heat, frankly, from liberals for being willing to stand up for what have been abuses that have negatively affected Donald Trump, standing up against the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop story, for instance, and has been very consistent on issues like Julian Assange, et cetera. And I do think a lot of the confusion and the flip-flopping that can look like flip-flopping from 5,000 feet when you zoom in, what it really is that there is a centrist majority, that is some conservatives and some Democrats, that are largely aligned with social media companies and everything else. And that it's a liberal, neoliberal, centrist majority that tries to maintain the status quo, and it can be reactive against figures like Donald Trump and can be reactive against figures on the far left, whether it's a Bernie-style person or, in this instance, pro-Palestinian protesters. So then I do think that is, I think, one of my pushbacks to these kinds of stories, which is, if they are not sufficiently framed as a kind of a top-down narrative as opposed to well, the other side is doing it too, they can very much be weaponized by the very neoliberal partisan flanks to insulate themselves from criticism or to justify their own use of the very tools that we're criticizing right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I take your point, and I think it's a fair one, and that neither side, if we look at them broadly, is homogenous. And maybe a better way to think about it is sort of like counter-populism, right? I think that you have various elites by their nature are the people who kind of control the institutions, right? And they fear populism from the left, and they fear populism from the right. And look, not all their fears are 100% unfounded. I do think, a lot of Trump's behavior around the election in 2020 was egging on things that ended up being very unfortunate, culminating in the riot on Capitol January 6th. But there's a certain time when you're kind of burning down the village to save it, right? I think that when taking legitimate fears about what's happening with Donald Trump, or maybe taking legitimate fears about, certain speech being too just inappropriate with regards to the Middle East or whatever, and then responding to it in a way that just tries to suppress people and their legitimate desires, I think just isn't kind of the way to manage these conflicts, right? I mean, if you're someone living in Colorado right now who voted for Donald Trump in 2020, and I think somewhat over 1 million people voted for him in 2020. How do you feel right now? Do you feel like you're more included in the democracy? Do you feel like you're more open to working with Democrats and like solving problems and things? No, you feel like there actually is a deep state conspiracy out to get you. And, you're going to go in a more conspiratorial direction. And I think, speaking to your point, Brianna, I think sometimes people in the kind of the elite power centers who often do kind of identify as centrist or neoliberal or neoconservative, so on and so forth, they think that they can handle what they view from their point of view as extremists, as people who are radicals way out in the wings, by just shutting them up, by saying, they don't deserve a seat at the table. We can't normalize this, blah, blah, blah. But does that really work? Or does that push them off into camps that maybe become more conspiratorial, more extreme? And because then they have a legitimate grievance. Their legitimate grievance is that they're not being allowed to participate in a democracy. And I think a lot of people who supported Bernie in 2016 felt that way by how the by how the Democratic leadership was marginalizing them. And I'm sure a lot of Republicans feel that way right now.
Yeah, I try to distinguish. I agree with you, Brianna, about not tagging the left necessarily. I have a lot of experience dealing with the left. I know, I knew from the get-go that the left was very skeptical of the Hunter Biden censorship and a lot that got revealed by the Twitter files. I wouldn't necessarily use centrist, I would say, to describe these people, because their cultural and social views are very progressive, or at least in a performative way, maybe wokeness, DEI type stuff. So, I would distinguish progressive from left. There's been principled people on all sides of the spectrum warning about the threats to our civil liberties and our free speech coming from this blob of whatever we want to, this amalgamation of
I think we
agencies.
just need a new word to describe these people, because they're almost outside our current political lexicon, but they're very powerful. So yes. Whoever wants to volunteer one.
Zaid, Jilani, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.